Right, Chapter 10, talking about Andrew Jackson, the Jacksonian democracy. Andrew Jackson really changes the playing field for what presidents are, where they come from, what they need as a background to gain the presidency. So it's a big change in American politics as Jackson becomes president. And he has some pluses, he has some minuses as president, but he definitely changes the feel of the presidency. Real quick, just before we jump into the slides, one thing on tech time, and I'll mention this in class as well. I got the dates wrong, and I was not, part of it was with your guys' winter break early next week. I didn't realize that cohort A and B would flip-flop to Thursday, Friday. So what that means is really it makes one presentation earlier and a bunch of them a day or two later. It's not a huge change, but just to be aware of. Again, we'll go over that in class so everybody's aware of what dates they're doing. I don't see really a good time for more team time. You guys got a little bit done yesterday, but we may have a chance for, say, another 30 minutes to refine or work on. But I would keep working on that who, what, why, where, when, how style, and you guys start putting together slides and just amend them as you go, because even if the presentations are early March, it'll be here before you know it. Time always sneaks up on us. Okay, and I think that's it. The next quiz is a little ways down the road, so it'll start February 18th and run through the 20th, which is, again, a Thursday through Saturday setup. So you get a little time off since we just completed the midterm. So that's it for tech time. So talking about Jackson. Now what I did for the classroom side for cohort B, which you guys don't really care about, this is a two-part, there's a lot to cover, but I'm going to try to do it in one sitting, so it'll be probably roughly an hour, maybe a little bit less, but you'll see two separate pieces of words of the day. And that's kind of the dividing line, talking about early and then really more about the presidency of and some of the tumult created by Jackson. We ended up yesterday with this, looking at the growth of the country from the turn of the century up through 1840. And you can see the coast was always kind of the focus, that northeast coastline. But now we're seeing movement inland, at least slightly. And then as we move to the 1840s, along the Erie Canal, right, and down along the Ohio River, it's not as easy to see, but on the Great Lakes, right, Detroit, Cleveland, Columbus, Dayton, Cincinnati, these are actually on rivers. They're just not shown on this map. So we're still tied to waterways, right, Nashville, Tennessee River, or at least some access to water, the coastline. So you see some growth, but it's still really focused in this industrial northeast area as the Industrial Revolution really gains steam, the textile piece of it at least. One of the other things we've talked about, and this leads into the Jacksonian presidency, is early on, look, 4 of the first 5 presidents come from Virginia. And if you remember way back, we were looking at which of the colonies looked to be potentially the most powerful. We looked at Pennsylvania, Virginia, maybe New York, but you can see at least politically, Virginia is extremely powerful. And you see, of course, Washington, no party listed. You could call them a Federalist, but there wasn't really a political party. But then the stranglehold, the Democratic Republicans. We're going to see the Democratic Republicans actually fracture under one of the policies of Andrew Jackson and become the Democratic Party, at least name-wise, what we know today, different policies back then. And then a rise of another party against Andrew Jackson, right? And it's called the Whigs. But, you know, here's some of the founders, right? Washington, Jefferson, Madison, father of the Constitution, author of a bunch of the Federalist Papers. Jackson doesn't come from this mold, that kind of aristocratic planter class. Jackson's more of the common man from Tennessee. And so there's some good associated with that, but Jackson's also very dictatorial and autocratic as a leader, so he generates a lot of resistance as well. And we mentioned this, but it's a foot stomper. It's one of those to remember. Remember, doctrines are big policy issues, how we're going to conduct business as a country. And so the Monroe Doctrine under James Monroe as the president says this, and I bolded the last part, but to sum it up, as opposed to kind of this lawyeristic, confusing language, it says, Europe, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. If you try to colonize anything North, Central, South America, it can be seen as an act of war. Interesting, huh? It actually does work, though. We don't see a lot of colonization in this part of the world. Now, when we get to Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, we, the United States, are very active in Central America and the Caribbean. And then we ended with this idea that we're going from kind of this three-piece industrial, agricultural, raw material agricultural, stick type, still enumerated article based, but slowly the industrial belt moves westward, and we see the country divided sectionally, north and south. And that's going to manifest itself in almost every aspect, but certainly in politics of the day. Why? Well, the North was more in the realm of the Industrial Revolution, capitalistic society, right? Investment, factories, etc. And the North looked at the South and a slave-based economy and said, hey, you know, white Southerners are sitting on their porch sipping mint juleps, and the slaves are doing all the work. They must be lazy. In response, the South says, no, this is our civilization, our culture. And we see you guys up north as greedy money grubbers. It's all about profit. You don't treat your employees any better than we treat our slaves. In fact, and we discussed the idea of wage slaves, a wage slave is worse off because they don't get this cradle to grave care that a chattel slave gets. It's a fallacious argument. Yes, they weren't treated all that well. Factory work was difficult, dangerous, didn't pay well, but you always had the ability to say, that's enough, I quit, I'm going to go do something else. Maybe I'll move west, try to start a farm of my own. Slavery is becoming a more and more powerful force, and we saw the real catalyst to that was not the invention, because it sat around for a while, but the kind of rediscovery and use of the cotton gin, which helped clean cotton. And so the ability to clean 100 pounds instead of 1 pound in a day makes the demand for slavery explode. Because yes, I can clean it with the machine, but since I can clean it so much more effectively, I need more slaves to plant and harvest and transport it to and from wherever the cotton gin was operational. And so slavery that was on its way out now, boom, really goes up. And it becomes an economic imperative for the South. And the elimination of slavery could spell the end of the Southern economy, the Southern way of life. So you can see where the stage is kind of set now for these two sides to become more and more antagonistic toward each other. And the politics contributes to that. The Federalists dying out. Yes, they still were around for a while, but the Democratic Republicans really had a lock on the presidency, as you saw. And once the Federalists completely die away, there's a short period of time here where there's only one political party, right? And when that happens, usually bad things happen. We think of political parties as being, you know, so polar opposite and antagonistic today, but oftentimes that stress between two ideas of how the country should go works together to make some kind of compromise that works maybe not perfectly, but okay for both sides. When there's only one party, there isn't that inherent stress in the system. But so what we'll see is, as the Federalists fade, the Democratic Republicans will become Democrats, and the resistance to Andrew Jackson starts what's known as the Whig Party. And they're named after that old Whig Party from England that we talked about, you know, seems like many eons ago. One last piece of cleaning up from Chapter 9. I skipped over this just for sake of time, give you guys a little more team time. But remember, the country's expanded, and we just, you know, we looked at the Louisiana Purchase and how much that effectively doubled the size of the country. So now there's lots of land available, and so people are moving into that territory and want to buy land. Now, what happens, just like oftentimes when there's some kind of bubble, some kind of, oh, this is a great deal in the economy, there's loans given out to folks to go buy this land. But now when the banks, the Bank of the United States, says, you know what, we're undercapitalized, we need more money, we need to have our hands on more money so we can give more loans, but we're getting to the point where it's very risky. We don't have enough money here in the bank to cover some of the expenses we have. So what call in means is, hey, you need to pay us back this loan. And you can see the cascading effect. Remember, those promissory notes had, yes, you pay X amount each month or each year, but that caveat of or on demand. So if I say I need the money and I'm the lender, you need to pay it back at once. What a bad idea, right? Because if I had all the money at once, why would I bother getting a loan in the first place? And so you see this, that the U.S. the Bank of the U.S. calls in loans given to Western banks, Western being that Louisiana Territory area. Western banks go, okay, well, geez, we got to pay the Bank of the U.S., so we better call in our loans to the speculators. The speculators, or even just the general landowners, like, yeah, we don't have the money either. Oh, what's the dog's barking? So if they can't pay back the bank ends up closing, and you see this kind of cascading effect. We'll see the exact same thing on a grander scale happen with the Great Depression. When banks at this point don't have money, the depositors are out of luck. They can do nothing about it, right? The bank just simply closes, locks their doors, and if you didn't get your money out before we ran out, it sucks to be you. It does sound familiar. It's exactly what happened in the Great Depression. Okay, so words of the day. A couple things. This had been around, but Andrew Jackson kind of takes it to a new level. There's two things: a spoil system, and that's where, look, you help me get elected, you support my campaign, I'm going to give you a cushy job in my administration. And think about the difference, working in a government job 8 hours a day versus working in a mill or a factory for 16 hours a day with a much more dangerous job, poor pay. That's a pretty juicy incentive to folks. And this is a kind of a variation on a theme, but the same idea. So now I can dole out cushy jobs or good deals, or maybe make sure some money gets put from the Bank of the U.S. into one of my favorite buddies' banks, right, to move things around. Does that happen today? Absolutely. Right? Sometimes more than others, depending on how corrupt's the wrong word, but how much Jacksonian influence is in the presidency. And, cut right to the chase, former President Trump, was a huge fan of Andrew Jackson. And you'll probably see why as we go through his presidency. We still do this on occasion, like the Iowa caucuses, very early on, when we're looking at a field of, say, 8 Democrats that are running for president. You know how the primary process whittles those down, right? They do debates, they campaign. Pretty soon we're down to 3, 2, and then finally the Democrats and the Republicans, they'll pick one. That's their nominee to run for president. Now, generally, like in 2020, the Republicans didn't really have a primary because Trump was the incumbent. And almost never does the incumbent have a challenger, but it has happened. Caucuses are sort of like a primary, but they're more closed up. It's more the good old boy network, the really powerful party members, and they sit down and decide, okay, who's our best candidate? So this is an older system. Again, Iowa still does it in a sense, but today we're more familiar with primaries. This was the old style. This is what was done back in the time we're talking about. And so we're going to go through a series of elections, and just one illustrates some of the weakness in the Constitution in presidential succession if somebody dies, what happens when only one party runs, or one party splits into 2 or 3 sections or segments. So that's what all these are about. So back here, 1824, caucus, right? The groups get together, the good old boys, they sit around. Who is our best candidate? And we saw the dynasty that Virginia had. So a Virginia caucus would be a very powerful thing as far as selecting the next, at least potential president. And as far as cabinetry, you saw Washington's cabinet, right? Only 4 positions. Thomas Jefferson was his Secretary of State. That is becoming more and more and more powerful in the cabinet. It still is today. It's probably the most powerful uh, cabinet position. And so here's our 1824 list of uh, potential presidents, right? This is the field that's running. And look, you can still see a very strong, albeit not Virginia specifically, but still a very strong Southern influence. And remember, part of that comes from the Three-Fifths Compromise, where Southern states have more representation than they would have without counting 3/5 of each slave toward their population. So that skew is still there, and it's going to continue until the Civil War is over. So we can see the different candidates: Georgia, Kentucky, Andrew Jackson, Tennessee, mentioned that. John C. Calhoun's an interesting character. We're going to see a lot of him all the way up and just to the eve of Civil War. And so the guy sticking out kind of is John Quincy Adams, who's the son of second president John and Abigail Adams. Okay? So there's your field. The Blue Star, this is actually just a useful link. It's Dave Leap's election atlas. And it's really, really fascinating as far as breaking down elections, electoral votes, down to the county level of who voted for whom. The only beef I have with Dave's website is he flips the blue and red colors for whatever reason, which is pretty confusing since we're getting used to, at this point, red Republican, blue Democrat. Be that as it may, this may be a useful tool somewhere down the road if you need it. Anyway. So you saw the field. Here it is, right? And so it's no surprise that none of the candidates get enough electoral votes to win the majority. In this case, somebody needed to get 131. And you'll see the numbers here in a second. So nobody gets the majority of electoral votes, thus it goes to the House of Representatives. And this comes from the Jefferson and his election going to the House to decide because they screwed up their voting. Oops. And so there's a bargain made. So Henry Clay, who's in the mix, who's running from Kentucky, puts his support behind John Quincy Adams. So now the folks that voted for Clay are leaning toward Adams. And in return, Adams is going to name Clay Secretary of State, that most powerful cabinet position. So it's kind of a scratch my back, scratch yours. I'll support you for president, you make me Secretary of State. And honestly, Clay had ideas of running again in the future. So he thought, well, I'll just do this time and maybe I can run myself again. And of course, this makes Jackson mad. He says, man, this is a corrupt bargain. That's what he called it. And you'll see why when we look at the votes, is Jackson had the highest number, still not 131, right? That was the magic number, but the highest and far and away on the popular vote side. Now, again, we understand popular vote isn't the be-all, end-all, but it does show popularity. And so you can see why Jackson might be upset about this. So Quincy Adams ends up winning. There he is. Dun, da, da, da. Supposedly the common man. But you noticed out of that list, he was the only one from the Northeast. The Adamses are from Massachusetts. Age of the common man? Well, maybe not yet. So, yeah, he had some impressive credentials based on his background, his education, his parents, right? His dad being the second president of the United States. But he was all kind of a snob, right? Standoffish, elitist. So definitely not the common man. So the thought was we're moving away from kind of the held on a pedestal, held on high founding fathers to more just the average person. But we're not there yet. Jackson is definitely a step in that direction. So he tries to stand above all this party politics, but that's when it's becoming more and more important. And one of the things in the Jacksonian era is how political campaigns were run, and it moves us, even though this was so many hundreds of years ago, to more of a current model, that it's more about image than substance. It's more about, can I degrade my opponent rather than talk about what I'm going to do? And so he tries to stay out of that fray, but what it does is it makes him kind of disconnected from what's going on. So now enter the common man, Andrew Jackson. more so than John Quincy Adams, perhaps, but Jackson, I wouldn't call him a common man either. And so now we move to 1828, the next election. Remember, 24, Jackson was like, that's a corrupt bargain. That's terrible. So now we're going to run. Of course, Adams is going to run. He's the incumbent, right? But Jackson's going to run again. And in this campaign, now we start throwing mud, as it's known, slinging mud, putting dirt on the opponent, which is how things seem to work now. And why is that? Well, if it didn't work, candidates wouldn't do it. And if I throw mud at my opponent, now maybe he or she has to defend herself and clear her name from that mudslinging, as opposed to standing up and saying, here's what I'm going to do for you. Here's my policies. Here's my ideas. It's too bad, but it often devolves into just a fight of who can race to the basement first. And so all these Blue Star videos, of course, you guys are welcome to click on them and watch them. We're going to watch them, the class side of it, a few of them at least. But it illustrates some of the tactics used in political ads. Okay, this one I would recommend watching, this Jacksonian Politics. It's about 5 minutes, but it's not even that long. It's about 3. Kind of explains how Jackson operated, how he was borderline dictator sometimes. And then this last one, the 2016 focus group, is a guy named Fred Lunds, who's a Republican pollster, but he did a focus group, a bunch of people who were looking to vote for either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. It was a 2016 interview, and how quickly both sides immediately got at each other's throats. They weren't listening to each other, right? That idea of the middle, that Springsteen commercial, you can see how we're so polarized. So that's not a bad one to watch either. Aha, this time Jackson wins the election, and he wins it pretty handily. The common man, no, that's what I would say. He's an uncommon man. Look at, his background. But as he enters the White House, now the detractors of Jackson say, look at this mob, right? All he was he was able to get more and more people to vote. Look, to me, that's a good thing. The more people have a say in the election, the better. He was a successful land speculator. He's going to get in trouble with land speculation out west, though. A planter, a soldier. Remember the Battle of New Orleans, right? After the treaty was signed to end the War of 1812, he goes barging into New Orleans and defeats the British there. That elevated him to the national stage. But he does have some really actually progressive ideas about American culture and American society. And he's a believer in what today would be more Republican-ish, limited government. Okay? That the government doesn't have to get in and decide everything. So you can see this time, this is, borderline landslide victory. The other thing that's interesting to notice on these maps is the country, what it looks like. So almost all, still the Michigan territories haven't been made into states, and we're going to see a couple come out of them. We've got Arkansas, looks like it's getting its act together to become a state. We've still got this portion of the Louisiana Purchase yet to be organized. There is movement out here. Remember Lewis and Clark going out to the West Coast? But this part of the country is still Mexican, part of Mexico. Okay? So you can see the movement, and you can see, John Quincy being from Massachusetts, where his support was. Jackson everywhere else. Call it the revolution. Maybe that's too strong of a term, but it's certainly a big change from the past, the founding fathers type view. Jackson, he looked at women as being morally superior to men. Guess what? As we move into the 1900s, somebody's going to pick up on that idea to help push the right to vote for women over the finish line, that women are more moral and could clean up this dirty politics. They should be protected. They should be treated with deference, right? Chivalry. Children, when you see how he treats the natives, you would think that wouldn't be the case, but gentle, indulged them, which was not common, right? Back then, right? Children should be seen and not heard, that kind of idea. spare the rod, spoil the child. There's all kinds of sayings about how to treat kids, and most of them were pretty militant. On minorities, he's a Tennessee man, so his views are in line with other Southern politicians, and he sees the races as incompatible, right, forevermore. And for those that opposed him or those that supported him, really on both sides, he creates that spoil system, which was why it was a word of the day. So spoils, patronage, you help me out, you're a buddy of mine, cushy job in politics, in the government. Still happens today. He was the first one to really get out there and do that. The other thing Jackson does is, up until this point, I won't say they were figureheads, but the presidents were not nearly as involved and powerful as we see today. And even Jackson, as compared to a current Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, still not as powerful. The presidency has gained strength even with checks and balances over time. But he pushes it forward enough to make it noticeable. And so they start to call him King Andrew I or King Jackson. And we know, based on the history of the country, calling somebody king is actually a threat, right? Or detrimental, a slam on him. King. We don't have kings. We have Mr. President, right? And this is counter to this man of the people idea. And so there's going to be a movement, a push against King Andrew I. And here's some, look at the detail of this. And I don't expect you guys to read it because I can't. But it's a flyer going out to campaign against Andrew Jackson, General Jackson. Look at the death and destruction that he has wrought. And here's maybe a better one. Right? This is a Whig political ad. And you can see born to command, of veto, of veto memory. Had I been boy, those are tough to read. Had I been consulted. Right? King Andrew I. That's the point. This part right here. He's King Andrew, and there he goes. Now I'm King Andrew. Dun, 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 dun. Born to command. And here's, well, what does that look like? It kind of looks like the second half of the Declaration of Independence. Here's what he's doing wrong. So are we going to let him reign over us as king, or are the people going to rule? So where do you think the Whigs are focused as far as power in the three branches of government? They're trying to push it back to Congress. And that's the idea behind the Whig Party. Jackson does. We looked at the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution and how transportation really affects the growth of the revolution, the movement of food to and from, all those things. So he has an eye toward that. He's looking toward the future. So a lot of internal improvements. But one of the things we saw, the national road, there's a federal road, at least theoretically, going to be built in Kentucky. And Jackson says, no, that's unconstitutional. And you're like, well, wait a minute. He was supposed to be doing all these internal improvements. Well, why? Because, remember, Clay, through his support to John Quincy Adams, if we build a road in Kentucky, where Clay is from, it's going to benefit him politically. So Jackson says, nope. Right? We've seen that before. We'll see it again in presidencies. The Indian Removal Act, this is probably the darkest chapter of the Jacksonian era. It passes not by a huge margin in the House or the Senate, but he signs it into law that we are going to remove the Indians, and specifically the 5 civilized tribes, as they're known, from this area where we live now. And he does it against a Supreme Court decision, which a lot of people don't realize. Old treaties thrown in the trash. I'm going to take it. This is a very English approach to things. You can either do this how I want you to, and if you disagree, I'm just going to take it. Good luck. And part of the reason the land in Georgia was so valuable, right, the Cherokee area, the Cherokee Nation, one, it's very fertile, but two, there was actually kind of a mini gold rush in this area back then. So that added to the, we're going to take your land and sucks to be you. So it leads to this idea, the Trail of Tears, which is, memorialized down at Ross's Landing in Chattanooga. And so The Cherokee, they figure, you know what, we can fight with weapons, or we can fight them in their own game with taking this to the Supreme Court. And they do. Okay? So here's what's going on. Georgians determined to take. Gain is a nice word, take it. So they take their case, the Cherokee take their case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decides, judges in the Cherokee's favor, that yes, you know what? They have a right to this land just like any other citizen of this country. So Jackson says, you know what, Supreme Court, you can say that, now you come enforce it. And he totally ignores it and takes him out anyways. And of course, what's the Supreme Court going to do about it? Could they have impeached Jackson? They're not the impeachment element, right? That's the House and Senate. And they had already voted for removal of the natives. So you can see how they were, Jackson knew what his hand was and he played it. So he said, I'm going to ignore it. And that idea, nullify. Hold that thought for a second. So this Trail of Tears, moving the tribes from the southeast and Florida, by the way, out to what becomes Oklahoma, which is the last of the states in the lower 48 to become a state. It's known as Indian Territory for a very long time. And if you've been through Oklahoma, it's not a garden spot. And so they're moved, the Trail of Tears, so-called because almost 1/4 of them die from exposure, cold, starvation, illness, attacks by white people. It's brutal. And they're kept out there on what's going to become known as reservations by the U.S. Army. So not a pretty chapter. 4,000 die. So that if it's 1/4, do the math, right? 16,000, somewhere up to 20,000 even, moved out of their native or ancestral lands. And by the end of Jackson's second term, because he does get reelected, Indians are effectively gone from southeast U.S. Not 100% obviously, but as a large contingent of people, gone. Here's one map that shows the different areas where they're moved from, and of course the Cherokee right here, the Nuakota. There's a museum down there. That was the capital of the Cherokee Nation, and so you can see how they're moved out of the 5 civilized tribes, and then the Seminoles down in Florida, moved out to Indian Territory, what's going to become Oklahoma. Here's, I don't know if it's a better chart or not. It kind of shows the Oklahoma outline a little bit better, but it also picks up on moving the Seminoles, and some of them moved by ship across. So this Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears. And so here's some propaganda, right? Look how, how proud they look, how kind of peaceful and settled this whole thing is. Not the case. And so this is this is about a 5-minute video, the Blue Star, but it's a pretty good summary of not only Jackson, but of the Trail of Tears itself. It's worth watching. We'd be remiss living here with John Ross's house, a stone's throw from both my house and the school. And so here, the kind of the background. Why? Why did they want it? Well, the soil's fertile, but I did mention there's gold in this area, right? And so Ross, the Indian chief, is kidnapped. He's later released, but it shows the tension. And so once that happens, he goes to Washington to lobby Andrew Jackson. And they meet and discuss, okay, give me a price. Maybe we can pay for this land. So Ross says, $20 million seems like a fair sale price. But eventually Ross agreed to let the Senate decide on the sale price. A mistake, maybe. He gave him the $20 million price as a sale price. He estimated the land's value at $7+ million. The Senate agrees to pay $5 million in this Treaty of Nuakota. So you can see how the price is getting whittled away. And there's also a clause in the treaty that allowed those who wanted to stay to stay. That, you get your 160 acres, kind of like the Homestead Act, like people are getting as they move out west. But of course, that was later lined out by Jackson. So even at that, he had his hand in making life miserable for the natives. So there's a picture of John Ross house, if you want to go visit it, right down, just on the state line, basically. And of course, down here, this is Ross's Landing. down by the aquarium in Chattanooga. This is what my image of um, Indian reservations, having been out west. When I graduated from college, I took 3 months and just disappeared out west and went all over the place. And driving through some of the Sioux, Cheyenne, Navajo reservations, this is typically what they look like. They look like rundown trailer parks for the most part. So there's still this kind of legacy of bad treatment from all the way back to the founding of the country to now. Um, we still have not really treated the Native Americans the way we should have. Let's just leave it at that. And here's my least favorite person. Um, Look, these are natives. They're being met at the White House by then President Trump, and look at their chests. They're covered with medals, right? Of course, they're wearing some of their native garb. But these are, look at this guy's hat, Iwo Jima survivor. The natives were used a lot in World War II because of, for whatever reason, they had the mental makeup to be very effective code breakers. And so they did a lot of that during the war. But even if former President Trump knows nothing of history, which he doesn't, somebody on his staff should have taken that picture down. Look, you can love him or hate him. Trump loved Andrew Jackson, that's fine. But to memorialize and to give honor to these guys, natives that had served in World War II, that picture should have been taken down for at least the time of the ceremony. That's my opinion. All right, so here we are, second half. We're about on schedule. This will go a little bit quicker too, but my head's in the way. All of these terms have to do with how Jackson's going to deal with a problem when the land speculation kind of collapses. What we had talked about there, just as a review from last chapter. Okay, so what he says is, okay, money's not worth as much, paper money now, so if you're going to buy land from the government, it has to be in gold and silver. Well, that naturally constrains the money supply because not everybody, in fact, very few have gold and silver. So it causes a cascading effect that's going to really explode on the next president because that's kind of how it works. Jackson leaves before the spaghetti hits the fan, so to speak. So what is that? What is a gold standard? Well, if we had that, which we don't today, it is all the money in circulation is backed up by a quantity of gold in reserve somewhere. And at one point, the U.S. had that. We had a gold standard, a gold and silver standard. Now the only thing money is worth, and we talked about this with the debt class, was or is the full faith and trust in our government. So if we just start defaulting on our loans on our $28 trillion debt, our money becomes worth nothing. Right? We're going to see, I'm going to use that as an example at the very end because it generates this. If money loses value, that means it costs more for a given product. And if it gets to a certain point, prices are going up so fast you can't even keep up. That it's going to take 10, then 100, then 1,000, then $1 million to buy a very simple thing like a loaf of bread, so that the money becomes basically worthless. Right? And this can occur. It can occur in a lot of different ways, but I'm going to give you a specific example. That's why we can't just go out there and just print $28 trillion worth of dollar bills and pay off our debt. Dumping that much into the economy would make every dollar worth less, to the point of being worthless, all one word. Okay? And that's what I just said, loss of confidence in the ability to maintain money, i.e. the trust in government. And here's the last one, primacy of. What the Whigs are going to argue is primacy, the first and foremost branch of government, is Congress, not King Andrew I. This was the presentation that nobody signed up for, and it's a tough one, but we're going to see some pushback from the South, specifically South Carolina, specifically using John C. Calhoun, who's a senator who becomes a vice president and then resigns the vice presidency to fight against these tariffs. And what happens is, if you recall, the South is more of the raw materials, sending that to the North to be manufactured, and then sent overseas or back to the South to be purchased. And so if we start putting tariffs on things, say we're going to put a tariff on English goods coming in. Okay, fine. But what happens is the English in return are going to put a tariff on American goods going out. And the raw material folks always take the bigger hit when that happens. So South Carolina, being the producers of cotton, let's say, are taking it in the shorts when this tariff is added. That's why they call it the tariff of abominations, right? It sounds kind of like the old, the intolerable acts, right? It smacks of the revolution almost. And so Calhoun defends this, that, hey, you can't do that. That's killing us here in South Carolina, and that states' rights are more important. Big S, smaller U. Now, his argument is not grounded in constitutional thought, but that never stopped John C. Calhoun either. And so what happens? His argument actually gained some traction. And so the tariff of 1832, because the first one's 1828, it actually lowers it a little bit, but it's not enough. And it kind of further inflames the South Carolinians and Calhoun because the rate's still too high. It goes from like 50, I've got it on a slide, it just slipped my mind. It comes down significantly, but it's still not enough. And so what Calhoun does is he convinces South Carolina to say, you know what, we're going to nullify these laws. And what nullification means is we're going to ignore them. We're not going to do it. And if you try to make us, we're going to leave. We are going to secede from the Union. And so that word, secession, actually starts to float around for the first time. And guess what? The first state to leave in 1860, after the election of Abraham Lincoln, is South Carolina. So this is sort of a prelude, a mini prelude to secession and Civil War. So Jackson, who had worked with Calhoun in the past, says, okay, pal, I'm going to pass this force bill, as it's known, and authorize the U.S. Army to come down there and collect the taxes, collect the duties involved, and at the same time kick your butt, perhaps. And so South Carolina pushes to the point that Jackson pushes back with the force bill, and they back down with the help of the great compromiser. Here he is again, Henry Clay. So we're going to slowly get these tariffs down to the point where they're agreeable, and we're going to avoid this potential conflict between the U.S. and the state of South Carolina. So tempers cool a bit, but that idea remains, and we're going to see it raise its head again in the 1850s and, of course, in 1860. And so here's kind of your graph of the reduction, right? So if we know this was a reduction in 1832, you can see how year by year they brought it down slowly. But that means 1828 was even a little bit higher than this. So you can see why Calhoun would have a beef. A 50% rate of tariff on clothes, holy moly, that's huge, right? You take the price and add another 50% to it. No wonder they were angry, but it seems like, well, cooler heads did prevail eventually. Let's just say that, shall we? And now just, an FYI, if you look at who voted for it, by state or by section of the country, interesting, right? The New England area, because most of the mills are up there, vote a little bit more against it. But what's more interesting, perhaps, is the division of free states to slave states. Who voted for, who voted against? Raw material producers voted against. Manufactured voted for. Again, do we see some of the tension inherent in the free versus slave as the country's growing, as the Industrial Revolution's kicking in? So that's why I throw that up there. It kind of illustrates some of that stress. And this is a graph of different tariffs we've had over time. You notice lately, and this ends in 2000, Trump threw some tariffs on China, so that would have spiked up a bit, but nothing like what was done in the, oh, my head's right in the way. Two screens killing me. This was during the Great Depression, the Smoot-Hawley tariff. Here's your tariff of abominations. It was the biggest, baddest of all. So you can see we can extrapolate up to about 65%. So that's why down to 50, hey, we lowered it. Boy, that's not low enough, pal. How tariffs work. we're going to watch this in class. So I recommend you guys, this is really short, and it becomes known as the rubber chicken war between China and the United States. And I think it explains tariffs quite effectively. So I recommend watching this video, the Blue Star. It's only a couple minutes worth, but it helps explain what's going on in this picture, right? Adding tariffs to make our products more attractive, at least equal and maybe even a little bit cheaper. The problem is we throw $1 tariff on British-made cloth. Great. Ours is cheaper. People will buy it. But what's Britain going to do in response? Something that we're exporting to Britain, they're going to throw a tariff on. And it goes up. Trade war. Okay. The rubber chicken thing is kind of funny, but it does a good job of explaining it, honestly. Okay, so we're moving toward, you know, the second term, toward the end of Jackson's presidency, and you saw already some strife between him and John C. Calhoun. Now we're going to bring in a guy named Martin Van Buren, who's eventually going to run for president. And they're all, it's like this triumvirate fighting against each other. I mentioned this before, but Calhoun sees the North and industrialization as a threat. And he had tried in the past, if you remember, he tried to get the South to be a little bit more industrial, to do some of what's going on in the North. So now I can take my raw materials and manufacture whatever I need in the South. But that doesn't really happen. It stays more of that agrarian slave-based plantation economy. But he does strongly advocate for states' rights. We saw that in the nullification crisis. Hey, we, South Carolina, don't like it. We're going to ignore it. We're going to nullify that. Okay? And of course, slavery being endemic in the Southern economy at this point. One of the things that kind of tears these guys apart, because they were president and vice president for a bit, Jackson discovers that Calhoun criticized him and, you know, his invasion of Florida, his fighting the Seminole Indians. And so that doesn't sit well. He's not a man to take criticism. Okay? And you can see there's a lot of why Trump liked Jackson and some similarities between the two. Okay? Calhoun had forced that states' rights issue. He'd supported nullification. So you can see where those two would split, right? No more friendship between them. And now we're going to throw this guy Martin Van Buren into the mix. And so as part of Jackson's spoil system, right, Van Buren, help me out. I'm going to make you minister to England. Pretty cushy, cool job to have, right? So that's all good. But guess what? Calhoun doesn't like it. And so he gets in the mix and he blocks Van Buren's nomination as minister to England. So he has to come back to the United States. So what does Jackson do in return? He names Van Buren as vice president. So you can see this kind of tit for tat, very petty, very small-minded in a way, right? And there's good old John C. Calhoun, right? Yeah. Who does he look like? To me, he looks like the guy from Back to the Future. Right? I try to do this once in a while. Who do they look like? And Calhoun's really got that nice neck beard thing going there, right? Scary-looking guy. All right, talking about finances, kind of closing in on the finish line here. The Blue Star videos, they're short videos about some things that happened with Wells Fargo a few years ago and their criminal activity, which is why I will never, ever, ever, ever bank at Wells Fargo or even use an ATM machine. But the same, not the same thing, but a similar thing happens, this war with the bank idea. So we had the Bank of the United States going back to a Hamiltonian kind of a central bank of the U.S. And it was run on a charter. And so the second Bank of the U.S. charter runs out in 1836. But while it's active, the Bank of the U.S. acts, the word's fiscal. They dictate monetary policy. Now this is a private bank. It's not the Federal Reserve that we know today. It has immense power because if I can control the supply of money, I can control inflation, who can buy what, cost of goods, all kinds of things. So really they have a lot of power. And the critics of the Bank of the U.S. say, you know what, you guys, all you act in is shareholder and profit interest. You don't act in the public interest, even though you're called the Bank of the United States. So what can they do? Well, how it works is the government, right, from money from the government, from tariffs, from wherever else, income, we don't have a set overall income tax yet, but there are taxes on business and things like that. And so that money, the government money, gets put into the Bank of the U.S. The Bank of the U.S. holds that deposit, thus they're earning money or earning interest or have power over the economy. They can dictate to smaller banks how they're going to do things. And so this private institution is making a ton of money while not acting in the public's best interest. And so that leads to this idea. They get all the profit and share none of the risk because it's not their money, it's the government's money. They're just holding on to it. It's like a big pot, and because they have the big pot, they're making a lot of money off of it. And I ask, sound familiar? It probably doesn't, but it should, because it's almost exactly what happened with the mortgage meltdown just, 12, 13 years ago now. Public risk, but private gain. And so these investment banks gave out very risky mortgage loans, and when it all collapsed, the spaghetti hit the fan, they were like, oh dear, government, bail us out. Well, in this case, the government, $800 billion, bailed out these banks that should have been allowed to go out of business because they acted foolishly. Where did that money come from? It came from us, the taxpayers. Now, to be fair, most of them have paid that back at this point. But this bailout of the bank for acting foolishly kind of smacks of what was going on back then. They had all to gain and nothing to risk. Because when it all fell apart, they got bailed out. And this is what really fries my bacon, is even while they're being bailed out by the government, by our taxpayer dollars, they're giving bonuses left, right, and center to the very people that caused the collapse in the first place. And that makes me mad. Right? And so the Wells Fargo, I didn't explain. These videos, one is an explanation of what Wells Fargo did. Millions of fake accounts to make their company look better. And then the second part, is a little humor, I guess. This one is. The Late Show takes this Elizabeth Warren grilling the CEO of Wells Fargo as to explain what happened. And then Stephen Colbert has a little fun with it. So if you want to watch that. Right. So what does Jackson do? Well, he's a patronage kind of guy. So as the charter of the Bank of the U.S. runs out, now we don't have it. So now we're going to have to put money into other banks. So he's going to say, hey, take that money, put it in my buddy's bank, and this buddy's bank, and that money, the pet banks as it's called, party loyalists. In response, this guy Biddle calls in loans. So all of a sudden now we're in a war. Jackson saying put money here. Biddle saying, oh yeah, well you're going to do that. We're going to call in loans on it to retaliate. And what it does is this kind of house of cards collapses, just like it did with the mortgage meltdown. And so, okay, Jackson says, you know what? Since we're starting to have inflation, since money's not worth as much, and to avoid Biddle and what he's doing, you've got to make all land purchases in gold or silver, that species circular idea. Guess what? Not many people have that. And so we have an economic collapse because now money, inflation, up to maybe hyperinflation, is happening. Oh yeah, Jackson retires before, again, the spaghetti hits the fan. So this is toward the very end of his term. He retires, and the next poor guy gets to inherit this plate full of muck, right? And that happens all the time. So that question, should we print 28 trillion to eliminate U.S. debt? The answer is no, and here's why. This is a chart from the Weimar Republic, pre-Nazi Germany, but you can see if you look at it, the value of a mark and how over time, this is due to the Treaty of Versailles. We'll talk about this a lot more later on. But some inflation, I mean, this is not abnormal. Prices do tend to go up. But if we start printing more and more and more money, the value of each mark goes down. So in the space of just a couple months, really, from July, August, up through November, look at that. That's almost a straight line up as to how many marks it would take to make one gold piece. And what does that lead to? It leads to this. This lady's looks like she's using it to fire up her stove to cook with. Kids are using, thousands, tens of thousands of marks strapped together to play with as blocks. And that's what hyperinflation does. That's why At the time, it didn't get this bad post-Jacksonian era, but that's what potentially could happen if we go, crank up the printing press. $28 trillion later, we'll pay off our debts. Well, no, our loaf of bread will go from 1 mark to 200 billion marks. At that point, your money is worthless. And what happens? Economies collapse, countries collapse, and people like this come to power. Okay, so in response to all this new second party, I've mentioned them, the Whigs, right? So the Democratic Republicans are splitting. Jackson and his style are separating these two pieces. So now we have the Democrats, kind of the followers of Jackson, and those that splinter off start this Whig party. And the Whig party is social and moral reformers. Yes, they're really more about getting power back to the Congress, taking it away from King Andrew I. But what's also baked into the Whig Party is the sectional divide, North and South in this country. So you've got Northern Whigs and Southern Whigs. And so the lifespan of the Whig Party is very short because as we move closer and closer to Civil War, that split between slave and free states that's baked into the Whig Party effectively rips them to pieces. Abraham Lincoln started out as a Northern Whig, but when they come apart, some of those elements go back to the Democratic Party, the slave-supporting ones, and some of them blend in with Free Soil and American and others to make the Republican Party. Okay, so there's, I showed you that the picture before, the King Andrew, and here they got their name, the Whig Party, from the British party that was battling the king way back when. That's the foot stomp. The Whigs agreed, whether they're Northern or Southern Whigs, that we need to pull back the power from the presidency and reestablish primacy. Remember, primacy is #1 top dog of Congress. The Congress should be the most powerful branch of government. And of course, people that are in the House and Senate want that, right? They do to a degree, but again, Jackson moved the power of the presidency up a notch. And we've seen that happen a couple times. So did FDR, by the way. That's what they're saying. Jackson can't write and enforce the laws, right? Congress is supposed to be the one writing the laws. The blue stars are just a couple links to different czars, if you will, people unelected but in charge of a certain thing in the government. And that's a more recent phenomenon. And then a list of some specific executive orders that President Obama put forth. But all presidents do executive orders as well. Okay, so finishing up, I remember I said when a party splits up and runs 2 or 3 candidates, they usually lose. That's what we're going to see here. So this new Whig party, you've got different elements. Webster, a Whig, but a Northeastern, right, from New England. There were Southern Whigs as well. And the Democrats run good old Martin Van Buren. Remember him? The guy that got blocked going to England. And so the Whigs say, you know what? We'll run 3 candidates. We'll run a Northern and a Southern and maybe another Southern candidate. That way nobody gets enough electoral votes and it'll go to the House. And somehow we'll be able to win this thing. Guess what? It backfires. So Van Buren wins. The Whigs, who are in 3 pieces, lose, as is normal. But Van Buren gets to inherit this plate full of poop that Andrew Jackson left him with the economic mess. And that leads to a depression. And guess what? If you're president during a depression, you're never going to win again. It's an absolute. And so how often does the next president inherit the good and bad of his predecessor? Always. And if they inherit the good, they claim it as their own. And if they inherit the bad, they blame it on the last person. And I guess that's normal, but why not just pick it up and go with what you have and do your own thing and talk about that instead of taking the sunshine but blaming the other guy? And they all do that. So here you go. 3 different Whigs. Harrison, White, Webster. You can see Webster. He wins Massachusetts, that's where he's from, and that's it. And then let's just throw in an independent guy just for grins. So you can see if I split up all 3 of these Whig supporting groups, I guarantee the other guy's going to win. We're going to see the exact same thing in 1860. How did some nobody named Abraham Lincoln, who had barely been on the public stage nationally, win the presidency? It's because the Democrats fractured into pieces over the issue of slavery. Okay? And look, the map's changed a little bit. Now we have a Republic of Texas. This is an independent country at this point. Michigan finally joins the Union. Now we have the Wisconsin Territory. Oregon, Indian Territory, right? And this area here is going to become Oklahoma eventually. All right. Finishing up. Van Buren for re-election, right? Bill Clinton said, it's the economy, stupid. And he's right. And so Van Buren has an economy that's in tatters. So guess what? He ain't going to win. So the Whigs run William Henry Harrison, and he wins. And so this new party has a president in the White House. Harrison wins on image. He can batter Van Buren on the economy because the economy is terrible. And so he wins. Fate's cruel joke. I may have mentioned this before. Harrison gives a 2-hour speech for his inauguration in the cold, damp, dreary Washington winter, catches pneumonia, and dies, like 6 weeks later? Okay. 1 month into the presidency. There you go. So don't give long speeches, especially when it's cold. And so that leads to our new president, John Tyler. I mentioned the 25th. The blue star is an actual link to who comes next, president, vice president, speaker of the House. Who's next? Majority leader of the Senate, different secretaries on the cabinet. There's a whole list of who comes next. But that doesn't come about for a while. So, yeah, Tyler, no re-election for you. He's kind of an irritant as well, very rough-spoken. And so now we have this 25th Amendment, so we don't have any issues with who comes next. It was passed in 1967, and you look at that, that's the height of the Cold War. So the reason it goes from president, vice president, down 20 levels is because the threat of nuclear war was such that all of the government could be wiped out with one bomb. So we've got to have somebody, the designated survivor, somebody that will survive to be in charge if that would happen. Okay, kind of interesting. And the very last thing, just over an hour, not bad. There was a president that was never elected, never received a single vote, either as vice president or president, and yet he was president. We'll talk about that somewhere down the road. Okay? Good. All right, so that's all. You can see where it was two pieces with the two words of the day sections, but now you can, pause it, whatever. It gives you all of chapter 10, and that will set us up ready for quiz next week. Okie doke. I will see you guys with the first 2 days next week. I guess I'll see you on next Thursday. Right, over a week. Boo-hoo. See you then.